feel incredibly honored to be able to talk to you. And I would like to thank PIDE and the World Bank to invite me and to be able to get some of my thoughts here. You know, I've been coming to Pakistan probably for about 13 years. And, you know, it's a country that is at one level hard to grasp from outside, another level very easy to grasp. It's at one level very easy to see what the problems are, and it's on another level extremely hard to see how you get out of them. And I want to try to talk to you and try to give you a way of thinking a bit about it. I'm going to provoke you a little bit, and please forgive me, but I will want to provoke you, because I will probably conclude that you're all part of the problem. Okay, and you all are one way or another, but you're also part of the solution, all of you, and not pointing just at the others. So that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about it. And by the way, I'm going to talk about the elephants as well. The elephants will be there. And there will be quite a few elephants. Sometimes I will talk about them, and I will sometimes name them even, because I think the elephants should be in the room as well. So, I want to briefly give you some facts. I like it silenced the room a little bit. I will give you some facts. What you know. There's things that you know and increasingly know because other people keep on repeating it. But just don't underestimate how that actually is. This is the last 3-4 decades in the world have been amazing in international development and growth. Amazing. So many countries have started to take off. Countries that we'd written off, and they're doing fast growth and they do inclusive development. And then there's a bunch of countries that don't make progress, or that they make progress far too slowly. Okay, so you're in that category, unfortunately. It's not as bad as the DRC, who has managed, the Democratic Republic of Congo, has managed to get their GDP now a third lower than it was in 1990. It takes effort, by the way, and I'll talk briefly about that. But it also takes effort to stagnate and being so below the median growth rate or the mean growth rate for lower middle income countries in the world. It takes effort. And I think I want to congratulate in some sense, unfortunately a little bit ironically, that actually you put in the effort to actually make it work. It was actually a relatively easy time to grow, and the opportunity wasn't taken. And the time will now be more difficult. And that's actually what makes it even harder where we are today. So when we look at the progress, you know, this is the kind of thing. Yeah, I don't want to be reminded of it all the time, but there are plenty of countries that were similarly in GDP per capita or poorer than you that have surpassed you. You know, you get India, you get Bangladesh that surpassed you. Bangladesh that in 1980, Henry Kissinger says, it's a basket case. Nothing will ever happen from it. It has surpassed you in GDP per capita. More in the market. Whoa. Okay, good. So you get to Bangladesh, that's even more in, that actually was more considered a much more difficult country to progress, and it has done that. Then you have countries like, of course, like India, but actually, for example, Ghana, African countries that do better than you now. African country, the GDP per capita of Ghana was the same as yours, and it surpassed it. Normally we talk about Africa is failing. They're surpassing you, there's countries there. Whether you do it in human development, the same problem emerges. When you do it in human development, yes, you've made progress, for example, on child mortality, number of children that die before the age of 5, but your decline is so much slower than many of the other ones. Should I do it like this? Okay. And that's important. The progress is there, you know, but it's so much slower, you know, and it actually was pretty hard to be slower in this period because there were so many simple reasons from both technology and things we learned about public health system and so on to progress, and then we didn't even manage to do it enough here. So my question here is, how do you understand the differences, and why do I, because I don't have time, maybe with not enough nuance, say that Pakistan is to some extent stuck? So how to understand these differences? I wrote a book about it, and I want to mention it. Not plugging it, you know, there's ways for you to get access to it, I'm sure, one way or another. But I want to emphasize here that the countries that I find quite remarkable that actually made progress are not countries that fit somehow a message of us, they all did the same. You know, you get India, Indonesia, China, Bangladesh, Ghana. These are very different countries. You don't need to know much about them, but I can assure you they're very different countries. And in fact, what's actually quite important is that if you do the diagnosis, the common factors are not the usual simple things that I used to teach in the textbooks of economics and why actually nations fail or not. In fact, you know, the kind of why nations fail hypothesis fails here entirely because these countries that made progress didn't have perfect institutions. It was referred to earlier, some scholars like Yuan Ang on China, making a big deal. China, when it started to take off in 1979, definitely didn't have perfect institutions. Whether it's about corruptions or the way things were governed, all kinds of things, it didn't have these perfect institutions. India, Bangladesh, Ghana, all these countries did quite a lot of, they didn't have this perfect institution. By the way, that's good news. You don't have to wait for that to make progress. That's good news, okay? It's also good news that actually it's not just, or in a simple way, just a political system. You know, I'm a Democrat at heart, and I hope that you can stay a democracy and a functioning one. But at the same time, we know that we have all kinds of regimes who did it. And those who dream of autocracy, I want to tell you that on average, autocracies did not perform better than democracies in the world in this period. In fact, the only thing that democracies did differently from autocracies is that the variance in performance is much lower in democracies. What it means, some of the best ones were autocracies and some of the worst ones were autocracies. And I like the idea that I rather pick those who actually lead me, because you're not quite sure what side of the distribution they will fall. And finally, and that's actually the most hopeful thing, I think, for Pakistan, all these countries find a way to do it within their own constraints and their political economy and their imperfections. They didn't have to simply take a blueprint that someone flew in from North America with a spreadsheet with some lines on it, and it says, this is the way you need to do it, and then they forgot to change the name from Azerbaijan to Pakistan. It's not necessarily that. By the way, what they have on that spreadsheet, it makes sense, but there's other things you can do as well. You can find within them, and I'll talk about countries who find within somehow constraining factors what they can do. And by the way, just as Matthew Vergas in the first keynote was emphasizing, he was emphasizing the Growth Commission, something that the World Bank and others had put resources in to try to review successful countries. What they found is this really important line. We don't know the recipe for growth, but we know the ingredients. We don't know the recipe, okay? So anyone who tells, I have the blueprint for you for success, you know, just look at them and say, I'm not sure. But I know somehow the ingredients, amongst which I have actually need to find somehow a way of cooking my dish. I'm happy with that. What does it involve? It does involve some reasonable things, like trying to keep facing. And there I say within your own politics, you can make choices. But by the way, I'm not saying anything goes. These failing economies, within that set of reasonable things, they kind of ignored it, and they picked somehow what I would simply call unreasonable economic policies. And that's actually not the idea about perfect economic policies versus the rest, but it's about what seems to be reasonable with enough correction if things go a bit wrong, compared to unreasonable ones. And there I say there's quite a few of them here. The unreasonable ones is clearly there. Now, the question then becomes, why do you pick unreasonable economic policies? The question is not, you know, what is the exact recipe? So many people say we know what we have to do. I think it's slightly overstated, but there will be some consensus about certain things, and we saw it in the polls, about some of the things that could be done and probably done better. Well, why do I pick the other things, the unreasonable ones? Why is then bright people, because by the way, I don't think it's a problem of capability in this country. You have incredibly bright people at all levels, including in the public administration. So why is it that the choices that are made are not so bright, are not so reasonable? And that becomes the key question then that you need to answer. And that's why you actually have to kind of start thinking about, you know, what is this country about? And how do we think about power, and who has it, and how is it used? And it's basically what I think about in the context of the ideas of an elite bargain. Basically, I say, it helps me that Douglas North, Nobel Prize winner, said something similar, so I'm not somehow a minor academic making it up. But he basically says, think of a state always as a solution to a problem of violence and deep instability. Think of your independence. And if somehow a state emerges when a deal is made between powerful people, a dominant coalition between elite groups is made, that somehow makes a deal about who has access to resources and who has access to activities, who controls the state, and how we're going to do it. Okay, we are at independence now. The choices were made. Lots of countries made choices in all kinds of ways. I think that's an important thing to think about. We go back long in history, but actually the idea of it's just long in history is not necessarily the key. I'll come back in a moment. Because at any moment of time, that deal between the elites seems to be renewed, or changed, or kept the same. And I want to be very clear. This is why I say you're all here part of it, because I think I would find it very hard if not 80% of the people in this room are not part of the elite as well. One way or another, in the elite as I define it. It's not just Islamabad Club, okay? So it's others as well. And basically, I think of the elite are those with power and influence one way or another. Some with more. It's a bit like Animal Farm. Some are a bit more equal than others. Okay? But it's basically in politics, in business, in the military, in the civil servants, the intellectuals, the academics, the journalists, they're all part of it. That's somehow an implicit deal that you have. Now, not everybody is totally the same place in the deal, but one of the power that these people have is that if they're not in power, they can destabilize the power. So they can always influence what it looks like at any moment in time. And that's an important thought to have. I was once corrected by a finance minister in Ghana and said, you want to be very clear that even if you're in the opposition, you're part of that elite, because you have the power to destabilize and make sure that certain things don't happen, because you react and you act in particular ways. So if that's how you think of a state, at a minimum, it needs to be a deal for stability. That's why we actually form states, actually. We try to contain random violence and all the things. We have a bit of this. So it's a form of keeping stability. The deal is essentially part of keeping somehow a form of stability in a place. It involves a political deal, it involves an economic deal, because it involves access to the state, access to resources, access to who can act, what they can do, what can they do in the economy, why you can have an entrant, why you can't have, whether it's in politics and in the economy. That's the underlying deal. And so if you start looking like that in a somewhat abstract way, you can start thinking you could get all kinds of societies coming from it. You know, we could go, and I mentioned Congo for a moment, the Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, it's quite an effort to get your GDP per capita to decline by a third over 30 years. Actually, it's pretty low. And this is not for nothing. We call these countries often a kleptocracy, where basically if you're part of the state, you have a license to steal without limit. And I'm afraid, having worked quite a bit in Congo, you often experienced it as well. You know, one way or another, it's all about grabbing. Whether it's the natural resources, whether it's from the businesses, whether it's random taxation and the whole thing. I don't think this is Pakistan, okay? There are people that steal, yes, but it's that's not Pakistan. I think Pakistan is more the other name that I put there. It's basically a system. The state that emerged is a state based on patronage. There are certain people that have the power to give to certain people. Now, on what basis do they give? To a strong extent, based out of clientelist objectives. Oh gosh, another political science term. What actually simply means you reward people for their loyalty, or you reward firms for their loyalty, or you basically give contracts to firms for their loyalty, and so on. So you have basically a clientelist system that is based on patronage as well. Okay? And so, by the way, it's very common in democracies. It's almost an essential part of democracy is that you reward your constituents for voting for you. So don't think this is something I don't see in Britain. The elite bargain that I see in Britain, I used to work as an advisor to essentially then a G7 foreign secretary. You know, I saw it in action during COVID. You know, some are a bit more equal than others. And also, there's some things that we would never touch on. You know, the fact that, for example, 500 families in Scotland own 50% of the land. One act of parliament could change that, but it would destabilize the elite bargain too much. It won't happen. So by the way, so I'm not trying to say you are bad and all the rest is good. Let me not start about lobbying in the US, in the way politics is financed and so on. So you get all these phenomena. So clientelism is there. And I think you have it, okay? And I'll come to that. But how do you then get development? And if this morning, Said Ali Hossein was already alluding to it. There's all these countries where clientelism clearly has happened. You know, sometimes it's reflected as corruption. By the way, most of the time it's not corruption, but just tax breaks and subsidies for some groups. That's often a much bigger part of revenue loss than actually the corruption itself. So I don't get obsessed with corruption. I think it's a useful political tool, but think more the system in itself, want to look at it. But you know, you have it in India, as people say, Bangladesh had it. You know, all these places have it. So why do they then have development and growth taking off? Actually, it's a rather simple thing. They made sure that in their system, despite all the flaws, there were enough incentives in place for growth and development. So somehow or another, despite the fact that in Indonesia, the wife of President Suharto was called Madame 10%, and the reason was her first name was Tien, which is teen in Dutch, the old colonial language, 10%. And basically every construction contract she would have 10%. Despite having that as deeply ingrained, there was actually plenty of good infrastructure being built. And it was still actually really delivery happening on all kinds of stuff. And the oil money was used quite well for infrastructure development in the 1970s. So somehow or another, they have a system where these incentives for growth are there. And this is what I call in my book the idea that to get development, you need to have somehow enough consensus about these players in the elite that actually growing the pie is worth it. You say that's self-evident. Why shouldn't they want to do it? I'll come to that. But actually growing the pie is there, and you make sure that it's there. And then you get these moments in history where you get a change in the politics and change in those who have power, where actually say, well, actually we're going to really set these incentives. That's 1979 in China. You know, you have an economy that's grown entirely or built entirely on dogma, on ideology of the party. All the way, the ideology is more important than anything reasonable in economic policies. What does Deng Xiaoping do? He forges a coalition in the party. By the way, it was never an autocrat. He had to all the time take his people along. He forged a coalition in the party, which is where power is, and made it strong enough to say, look, we're going to do this differently. And the reason why he wants to do it differently says we're losing all legitimacy as an elite towards the population. We want to survive as an elite, as the party, and we're going to actually see we need to do it differently. And how are we going to do it? Oh, it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. Pragmatic economic policies. That's basically China in a nutshell. That's what changed. They basically said, we want to keep power as an elite, but we're going to do it with more legitimacy, and the legitimacy we're going to offer through growth and development, with quite a lot of success, by the way. If you look at India, they actually, in 1991, switched from a system, the license Raj, it was referred to this morning as well, and they actually said, look, we're going to actually do it a bit differently. Took a long time to convince all the coalition, which included lots of the senior bureaucrats who said, oh my God, the license Raj is really good for us because we are the ones handing out the licenses. That's the way we make our money. Okay, but they actually got so, no, growing the pie, you will be better off as well. And actually they managed to somehow find a moment to actually do this, 1991. But actually the shift in the elite bargain is probably much later. And it was already mentioned today, and I'm going to then implicitly repeat it. It was not in 1991 that I say the elite bargain changed. Although Manmohan Singh, the finance minister at the time, was very confident. He gave speeches and said, this country is now different. We won't look back. It was actually happening not at that moment. It was happening probably in two bits, when they had to do the crucial votes in Parliament on that deal, which a minority government, by the way, had to try to get through. That means the majority, the rest of the parties, could kill it off. The left was agitating on the street, but walked out of Parliament, so the majority was much lower needed, and it not got passed. And secondly, somewhere, I think it was 1996,
the BJP suddenly started campaigning on the economy too. They've never looked back. For them, think of Modi, that's his recipe. I make India rise. Actually, it was really controversial in the party, but that meant all the main political forces were actually now aligned around growth. Now, that's what I talk about when it's a change in the elite bargain. So, and we could talk about this as well. Bangladesh, it's harder to date, lots of different actors, but it happened. The basket case, somewhere in the late 1980s, early 90s, certainly reset all its incentives. And we're going to go for sensible macroeconomic policies so that exports didn't face an overvalued exchange rate. They liberalized actually quite a lot because they really recognized, oh my God, are we making a mess of fertilizer inputs here? And in fact, government officials say that's probably the proudest moment when we stopped trying to run the fertilizer market. That's when they dated in 1982. That was our proudest moment in this whole progress, and so on. And you get Indonesia, could talk about as well. But basically, success requires that kind of deal, that kind of, within a dominant coalition. You won't get everybody on board, by the way, but somehow enough consensus around change that actually we need to reset these incentives. And it's about enough incentives, and it's about a group of people, a dominant coalition that needs to do it. A dominant coalition is actually quite tricky. It means not everybody, but you need to find a way of bridging divides between businesses, political parties, military, and so on around that. So why would they do it? So why would an elite do this? You know, why not simply sitting in the Islamabad club and just let it be as it is? It's fine there. So why change? Why did they do it? I alluded to it already. It's rarely out of conviction, by the way. Although I would say in Manmohan Singh in India, it was conviction. But I would say otherwise rarely. Think what I said about Deng Xiaoping. It's about losing your legitimacy. Losing entirely your legitimacy if you keep on running the country down the drain. If you talk to Chinese scholars, they will recognize that. That's what it was about. Let's deliver food security, which had never delivered to our population. Chinese population, we're talking about something like 90% was living in abject poverty at the time. They say, look, this is no more legitimacy, especially not for a communist government that can only offer paradise on earth. There's nothing there. It's legitimacy-seeking behavior. We find it in quite a few countries like that. You could say, but why don't they do it? Because you'll be better off with more rents in a growing economy. Even the elite will all be smiling and dancing towards the bank. You know, they don't have to do all kinds of complicated things because incomes will rise. Civil service salaries will rise, as we see in India. I have a friend in a senior position in India, and he said, isn't it tough during COVID? And said, look, none of these things are tough when your budget increases every year by 7% in real terms. And that's actually pretty good. You can do these jobs. But why do they do it? Because, of course, it's a gamble. Because you actually gamble about your own position. The status quo is what the elite knows. They know exactly how to play the system. In Sri Lanka, they try to increase, they were doing something about tax compliance now as part of the reform. Business leaders were deeply amusing to me. We had a session that said, we used to know how to do business here, and now we don't. I don't have to give more details how they used to know how to do it, by not paying the taxes and getting all the benefits. So, you know, that's a change, because it creates uncertainty. And actually, new firms emerge, new elites emerge. In the end, in Indonesia, that brought down Suharto after the Asian crisis. It's scary. In fact, there's some really great literature on democracy in Europe, and one of the classic papers says, as a simple title, Democracy by Mistake. It's when the elite actually gradually was giving the franchise broader, thinking it could control it, but in the end they lost, as aristocrats in the 19th century, the power. So let's not underestimate, and not that I want to feel sorry for the elite, but I should recognize that they may not be so willing to move. So it is a matter of actually building something where actually say, look, in the end, you could well be better off, but it will involve some things that you also will need to give in at first. So where we are in Pakistan, I know I'm pretty sure I need to rush now, but I'll try to actually give you enough food for thought so that you can attack me then in the Q&A. So where are we in Pakistan? Well, let me simply put it, and I'll talk about it. I don't think the elite bargain is cricket, okay? It isn't cricket, I think. Or maybe it is cricket, and I will explain in a moment my analogy here. So what I think it is, and I want to remind you, is that think of a state at any moment in time as a bargain between those people with power. You know, We talked a few times about the elephant, and there's other parts in the civil administration and in the politics that are all part of power. That's basically the elite bargaining, but there's a lot of circles around it, people that are commentators that can create stability, instability, that can talk it up, talk it down, they can create all kinds of things. So basically, there. But somehow or another, at any moment in time, there needs to be a coalition of sorts. And so the question is, who is the dominant coalition now, and what does their deal look like? Okay, so I have 3 points that I want to make on that. Ever since independence, the political and basically economic deal is one that is focused on just enough stability for status quo. I understand that. You know, status quo is what an elite knows. But somehow or another it's there. Let me explain this a little bit. History, you know, a set of families, some say 22, basically will have struck a deal. In fact, my colleague in Oxford, Maya Tudor, was referenced earlier. She's written eloquently about the nature of the deal at independence. Read her books. Very good, as an outsider looking into it. And so there's a bargain. I can understand that. Most countries had a deal there for some status quo. You can think of India as well, had a particular deal between particular groups, and so on. It was guaranteed by the army. They play a role. In a way, they control the elite bargain. I don't have to use euphemisms now. They control the elite bargain. They guarantee stability. And they control, in the end, the access. Who has access to the resources? Who has access to the rents? And by the way, who has access to the state as well? They control quite a lot. They guarantee it. And what we have underneath it is a clientelist patronage state that I described, where those people in high positions, not all of them, and in fact some of the ones that come here, clearly have a sense of much more duty and a meritocratic role within it. But there's a lot of it that is clientelist and patronage. And then what's the political system? This is kind of intriguing. Where you set up a competition, basically a political competition between some of these leading families and the parties they represent. And then somehow or another, I should have said these parties and the families they represent, they set up a competition about who should, in the end, control it. So it's not as if they don't have a consensus of how to actually do it, but because it's a pure winner-takes-all setup. This patronage state is set up as a winner-takes-all. If I'm in charge of the whole rent distribution. So that the incentives are there for the ones who are not in charge, do everything they can to kick the one in charge out and then come in place. Now, political consultation has its place. But political contestations in most countries has its limits. But of course, the price is high because it's a winner-takes-all setup. You take control. And then once in a while, a third party comes in. Oh my God, what a mess it creates. But fortunately, then the status quo can be maintained because everybody unites again, and then we get rid of them. I like the silence in the room. So basically, I think underlying is the incentives for status quo. Okay? I know there's nuances to it. It's much more dynamic. There's much more innovation even in the parties. There's much more well-meaning things in the military and the civil service than I describe. And now forgive me, I'm an economist, we use models to think about issues. But I fear that it actually is quite useful to think about issues here. One of the consequences is actually what it means for the economy. Because if you're obsessed with the status quo and it's a winner-takes-all setup, you end up running the economy as a zero-sum game. You know, basically, anything I get, the other one can't get. And you really make sure that anything you can get, the other one can't get. There's no common purpose in saying, this makes sense, let's collectively try to run this and maximize these returns here. No. I need to be in a position that I can stop the other one from having something and I can have everything. So it's a bit like where it is or where it isn't cricket. And I think this elite bargain, maybe it is cricket, you know, and you have the players here. You have the establishment, which I think are the selectors of the captains and the teams. Definitely play a big role in it. They are the umpires as well, and they rewrite the rules of cricket to suit. You have the politicians who play the game, very good, to the death almost. with plenty of match fixing and sledging. You have the profits, that's just shared between the selectors and between the umpires and the teams. And what about the public? Well, you all pay for your subscription, you all pay for the tickets. You are allowed to choose the man of the match, okay? So you're allowed to choose the man of the match. That's probably as far as it goes, because the rest is all show. The rest is all show to keep it, okay? Not sure if that's cricket these days or it isn't. I can't judge it anymore either. So that's quite important here. And it leads me to, how do you get an economy? Because we're talking about the economy. Now, you've had a growth-based economy where you said, look, we need to design the incentives just enough that actually growing of the pie it is. And by the way, you'll have to be sufficiently outward-oriented. You have to be sufficiently using the market and sufficiently with incentives, investment incentives somehow, with reasonable macroeconomic stability. That's what the Growth Commission says to me. It doesn't say it absolutely. There's no, you don't have to do Washington Consensus to the letter. You don't have to implement the plan that had the name Azerbaijan on it and changed in Pakistan. You don't have to do that. There's no blueprint. But you need to do something like this. And hopefully, you have your own. But at the moment, you have a status quo economy. It's centered around patronage and reward for loyalty at all levels, between the establishment, the politicians, and amongst the politicians in the civil service and the establishment, all there. So the result is somehow, it's all what people tend to call a redistributive system. It's all about redistribution. It's not about production of growth, it's about redistribution. Not amongst everybody, by the way, but amongst a particular group of people. It's basically a consumption and a low investment economy with lots of traders, lots of real estate, lots of protected groups in business and in the public. You know, you have basically, you have that system. It's not about how much taxes you have, but who is taxed. The system is designed about the who, not the amount. You actually tax, it's not about what is being taxed, but actually the first question is, oh, by the way, who is being taxed? I'm referring to endless tax exemptions, endless design rules. So anyone who wants to think, you know, what we need to do is to try to get 12% or 15% of GDP tax ratio, actually it starts on the wrong question. Because actually the 8.5, or I forget now actually, I was trying to get the numbers, it's even lower at times from numbers I see. You know, that's actually a political equilibrium. It's a political choice. You choose who to exempt, and you choose who to tax. And then you lower it all on a small group. You say, well, they're not important enough to worry about, so let's tax them a lot. And then blame the IMF in the process. So that's the way you could play the game. I think that's how the game, unfortunately, is played too much. It's part of that equilibrium. The same would happen with, you know, who gets subsidies, but also it's to do with the control regimes, with the nature of competition. You know, it's more important who is protected, what business is protected, than actually whether it actually helps the economy. It's more important what capital is protected than actually, and whose capital is protected, than actually what is good for the economy. So you get endless incumbents who can dream at night of just being monopolists. And then interestingly, I think most entrepreneurs' dreams of being a monopolist, but then the next day wake up and they are monopolists. Isn't that great? And nobody will stop them. Now that's amazing, and you could do it under the mum of being a state-owned enterprise or a private sector enterprise. Both can work. So, you know, you have a lot of firms, you know, and people say the private sector. We have lots of private sectors here. There's some private sectors that would never exist in the market economy, and there's some private sectors that try to struggle to actually survive in an economy like this. And actually the most interesting private sector you have in this country is the one that you don't have. That actually has never managed to emerge because it doesn't exist, because all the distortions stop entry into the markets and entry doing it. And then corruption, of course, is just one symptom. I think all these distortions, the tax subsidies, the breaks, the things, that's all part of it, and corruption is then one of these things. And this is a bit like, you know, and it was alluded to as well, corruption can sometimes be a really troublesome area to talk about because it all depends on what your laws say and what your executive orders say. In some countries, it would be corrupt to still have a monopoly and be able to stop a firm from entering. In other countries, you could talk to the minister and say, oh, I'll do an executive order, and they can't exist. Or I can go to the court and say, why don't you squash them? And if you find a friendly judge, they can do it. Now, that maybe no money gets exchanged, but it's still part of a clientelist state that is not growing. So you need to think a little bit deeper than the obvious one. There's only one flaw in this system, by the way. There's one flaw. Where are the rents going to come from? Because actually you distort everything. There's very little investment. How do you keep this going? So how do you keep a system like this going? Well, you can't. And so basically, if you run the economy as a zero-sum game and it's all about distribution, you basically get a situation, well, there's only one way to make money in this country, make sure there's no one competing with me to try to make money in this thing. But actually, sooner or later, the economy disappears. Competition matters. Interaction matters. So then you start wondering, oh my God, my rents are decreasing. I'm not rich anymore. So what do I do? So, and the problem is that because patronage usually becomes more expensive. You know, it's not a status quo because I still want to be a bit like keeping up with the Joneses. So if one part of the whole deal gets a bit more money, I need to get some too. And it gets more expensive all the time. So you need oil. You need to be oil. This is Algeria. You want to be Algeria without the oil. There's no way you can keep this going. You are Algeria without the oil. You are a Middle Eastern, North African country, but you don't have the oil. Okay? Those who know a little bit more about countries, you're a bit more like Jordan, that endlessly goes around the world begging. You know, we jokingly call the Minister of Finance there the fundraiser in charge. Would never happen here, of course. Problem is, without oil, you can't keep this going. You need external finance. And you say, my big constraint is external finance because I'm not producing it myself. It's external finance. I'm not selling anything to anyone, let alone the world. So basically, it's that. So I'm dependent on external finance, and that's where we are. So why is that choice being made? Why do you make that? Well, if your game is status quo, you're afraid of growth and development. If your game is status quo, you fear growth. Because it's all about not new forces emerging that could actually compete with you, whether it's because of you as an actor in the economy, or you as an actor in politics, or dare I say, as you as an actor in the civil administration. You don't want anyone to enter. That's a disruptor. That's why it's so hard to go to development here, because the status quo is very attractive for those who are in power. So, you know, we have the system as it is. And again, I want to emphasize the capability of the administration. A lot of people say that, you know. Clientelism is typically not a problem of technical capability. I remember in Malawi where the vice president tried to explain to me, you know, yeah, we have these things like corruption and not very good policies. Could you do another UNDP capacity building program? By the way, there's not a single UNDP capacity building program on corruption or on tax administration or anything in the administration will change this year. You have to just be conscious that it's not about capability, because several of the people there are pretty good at playing the game. It's actually quite hard to play the rent distribution game and not losing your job in the process. It's actually a pretty hard job. You need to please quite a lot of players. You need to find the rents and then you have to distribute them. So it's a pretty hard job you're facing. So actually there, so quick technical fixes won't work, and just understand that actually you have capable people. Why also did I say that? Administrations like the license Raj in India was berated being terrible and they couldn't even run their control economy. Bangladesh, low technical capability. Indonesia, civil service wasn't strong. Once the incentives were set well, nobody worried about it. Yes, then actually you can build up further their capability, but the capability is rarely the problem. With your GDP per capita, with your the extent of the educational system, with the kind of people you have in the civil service, it's not that. It's actually getting the right people to do the job that actually grows and develops and distributes social services and so on properly. That's the problem. By the way, international community, I used to be a chief economist of DFID. Hand up, I'm to blame too. I'm part of the problem too. The international system is part of the thing as well. Because we were so afraid of the stability of Pakistan forever that every time again we would give massive external finance. We were so afraid of what would be happening that, you know, after the Russian invasion, there was a wonderful windfall that could continue for a while. After 9/11, a wonderful windfall that could continue at the time. You know, I mean, which bank would ever give, after 22 overdrafts that weren't paid back, would give a 23rd one? Which bank would do that? Moral hazard exists. Okay, you have 2030 program, most of them have failed before. So why would you do it? Well, it's because you're afraid of the instability. Unfortunately, that aligns the incentives with the other forces that only want stability and status quo. Because then actually the finance comes in and doing it. It's very hard. And by the way, China is not going to help either. They are too shrewd with their money to actually do this. I remember for years hearing in Africa finance ministers saying, oh, China will never ask out their money back. Now they're in trouble as well because they did ask their money back. And if you think the Gulf necessarily is going to be easier, there's plenty of examples that it isn't. It's not a solution. Maybe it's important now because you have a constraint, but don't think it's the solution itself. So is this time different? Well, you would hope that if the financing constraint is a bit tighter, maybe there's some people that come together and begin to think a bit more. So what to do? How to fix it? At least we can have some lessons from other countries, and I will wrap up very soon now. The experience teaches that most countries did it when they were down, when things are really bad. We thought, I was definitely as a youngster hearing about China. I remember my elder brother telling me, I don't think China will survive in the 1970s. This was a deep internal strife. That was impoverished, had no more money, they were battling each other out, and it was just no way. Bangladesh was a basket case by Henry Kissinger. 5-10 years later, it begins to change. Indonesia was also predicted to be terrible, and so on. These places did it when they were down. Okay, Pakistan's in a crisis now. It should focus the mind. Most crises are wasted, by the way. Most crises are wasted. But it's usually an opportunity to at least begin to think a bit about it. And what it needs is an element of common ground and purpose. An element of it. I don't want to believe that suddenly we're all going to hug each other and be friends in all this whole system. Political systems, elite bargains, they're always a bit ugly. But actually, you can't get out of it unless it comes from inside. There's no outside force that will be able to help you. And it is the case that most changes will hurt at some point. And I will say what they could look like. You know? But what I find striking is that, you know, I talk to politicians in Sri Lanka, and someone from the left and someone from the right independently told me, we're all very conscious that the reforms have to happen, and probably the IMF program is sensible for us to do. But my God, will we fight them on the streets because we want to be in power, so we will never support them at this stage. And so basically, they choose instability now just because they think they will be in power, knowing full well they have to do probably similar things than what they are doing at the moment in Sri Lanka. Similarly, Mauritius, actually much more exciting. Mauritius did an early economic reform in the late 1970s. They were really on their knees. They called in the IMF. And what happened is that the incumbent political party lost power. A year later, another one that came in power lost power as well. And then a third government came, and they lost power as well. But they did one thing. They all knew full well they had to do this. So the technical advisory team stayed the same, and they saw through the IMF program. So we had a program starting around 1980. By 1987, Mauritius was growing at 7% per year. They've never looked back. They found a way, despite the political strife and the fact that the population definitely didn't think they did the right thing. They saw it through because it's hard to explain and hard to do. But there's no quick fix. You know, just the bits of new finance is not going to fix this. It just often delays it and makes change costly. So getting the basics right is important. So what is required? Well, it's building common ground. It has to be a part of a recognition, a shared recognition, that the status quo is untenable. I'm not saying that those people in the elite have to lose their position. I don't know. But they will have to change. They will have to set different incentives. You know, the elephant included. And even the elite is losing now. That's